Lovely. Thank you, Julia. Morning, everyone. My name is Adam Ireland. I'm the Learning and Development Manager here at AMIC, and lovely to meet you. And somehow this morning I've resisted putting either an England flag on my background or a British and Irish Lions rugby flag as well. So I behaved myself. And as a huge rugby fan, it was wonderful just listening to James, Hannah and Gregory in that last session. So leading on, nicely from that session, the next seminar with Gary, who I'll introduce momentarily, will highlight key insights from neuroscience and psychology relevant to developing and maintaining resilience and signpost potential practical application. A focus will be given to key activities to support brain health, explore the impact of habits, both good and bad, and give direction for practical action to support and restore resilience levels. So I've known Gary for a number of years now. I've had the privilege of listening to him speak on the subject of neuroscience and the brain and how it affects our behaviour, and his insights are always fascinating. So let me just introduce Gary briefly and then I'll pass over to him. So Gary Luffman is an occupational psychologist and co-owner Think Change Consulting, firm specialising in the translation of neuroscience and psychology into practical tools and techniques in the workplace. Gary's focus is on helping organisations to navigate change successfully and develop their workforce to meet customer and operating needs, achieved by bringing together neuroscience and psychology to develop tailored solutions and tools from this strong evidence base. Gary has a background in developing talent management and training solutions to support organisational strategies and goals, and is an experienced consultant, facilitator, assessor and coach who has designed and delivered courses for a wide variety of international audiences and clients. He's also a regular conference and corporate event speaker to large audiences, this not being an exception. So Gary, welcome, and the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Adam. It's always a bit funny when someone introduces you. You kind of think, oh, is that me? That is me, isn't it? Yeah, I remember doing some of those things. So a pleasure to be here, and it's really interesting to listen in to the previous session, and thankfully and unsurprisingly, so many things that they were talking about kind of dovetail quite neatly with some of the things that I'm going to cover in our 30 minutes. Wow, 30 minutes. When Adam first said to me, can you do something in 30 minutes? I was thinking, okay, well, that's actually, it was a really useful challenge because it made me boil down to the most important, pertinent facts that I believe are really useful to understand about the brain and its relationship with resilience. So I shall do my best in 30 minutes to at least pique the interest. And I'd be thinking that we've got a 30-minute sprint together. There needs to be a meandering that happens outside of the session. So you'll have access to the slides. I will be hopefully agitating your thoughts, putting some things in your mind, and I'll also be leaving questions on the slides so that in that meander that you do outside, you've got some structure. And what I would say is if you are keen to develop resilience, a really useful test will be, do you ever look back at this slide deck? Do you ever ponder some of the things that come up in the next 30 minutes or so? Because if you don't, that tells you something about your desire to do something about it. And if you do, hopefully that structure will be a good stepping off point. It won't be enough. There needs to be more, but it would be a good place to start. Okay. So in terms of resilience, I think it's worth just pointing out resilience is sometimes about having a shield or a defense mechanism so we don't get knocked over. Sometimes it's about being agile, flexible, so we bend rather than break. And I think sometimes it's about that, that idea of bouncing back, or potentially I prefer the idea of bouncing forward so that you've learned from an experience and you're kind of more forearmed for if something similar happens again. Okay. I don't need to introduce myself. You've done it beautifully, far more than I was going to do, Adam. But I think the thing I just wanted to point out is we work with a really wide variety of organisations. You wind the clock back far enough, you will find people, and people will typically act, react, in similar ways, and that is why we use these kind of three pillars of neuroscience, psychology, and practical application in the workplace for everything that we do. And today we're going to be doing the same thing and focusing those insights into the world of resilience. So when I was thinking about what could we do, what could we usefully cover, I've boiled it down to these kind of three chunks. We're going to start off very, very briefly looking at some pertinent things about the brain, drawing on some research and insights from neuroscience. We'll start to look at the world of habits and the role that they play with resilience. And then we're finally thinking about, well, what could I do? What can I actively focus my attention on? We heard Hannah and Gregory, you were talking about, that is the bit there, essentially. And when I was thinking about, I don't know how well that comes across, those three kind of elements there should be reflect. And I think it's the most important point when dealing, certainly with resilience, is a moment of reflection, so that you start to think about the stuff that is helping and the stuff that isn't, and then you will tailor your plan to you, rather than just because some bloke in glasses said something useful. Maybe you don't think it's useful. It needs to be related to you and your situation. But once you've got your plan, the next bit is practice, and lo and behold, the more time, more focus, more practice that you give to anything, the better you're likely to be at it. And I think that's really important when we're talking about some of the things within resilience, is not to beat ourselves up, not be mean to ourselves if we're not world class yet at some of these things that we might be talking about. It's like any other skill. If you haven't spent a whole bunch of time working on it, why should you expect to be good at it? Okay, so that's the overview of what's coming towards us. And before we jump in, I wanted to test, assessment, I don't know, quiz, take your pick there. I'm going to ask a few questions and see your knowledge of the brain, basically. So in a minute, you're going to have access to a poll. There's going to be 4 questions on the screen, 4 statements about the brain. And your job is just to work out which are the true ones and which are the ones that I've made up. Okay, so I shall give you the 4 statements, and then someone behind the scenes will make a poll magically happen, and we're going to have very little time, about a minute, to answer the questions, okay, or give your view. So, number 1, we use most of our brain most of the time. Number 2, about 20% of all of the oxygen, all of the calories that we take in are consumed by the brain. Cognitive decline begins to creep in at about 24 years of age. And brain cells shrink while we sleep. So let me know which ones you think are true and which ones are false. So I believe a poll should be being created as we speak. I can't actually see it, so if it's there, let me know. Okay, fairly even there. Okay, a quarter of us thinking that's not true. Maybe a lot of us really, really hoping that that's not true. And hardly anyone thinking that that is true. Brain cells shrink while we sleep. It sounds like sleep is the cousin of death, or something that we've all heard of before, perhaps. So if we could go back to the 4 statements, please. So what I would say quite quickly is all of those statements about the brain are in fact true. And I probably have to talk fairly quick for a while now before some of you think, I'm not sitting around listening to this bloke. He knows nothing about the brain, the charlatan. So my job is to try and, as quickly as I can, explain the fact that these are in fact all true about the brain, whether you like to admit it or not. So let me see if I can answer these well enough. So we use most of our brain most of the time. It's that kind of widely held belief that we're only using about 20%, something along those lines. And when you let me just say, it's absolutely ridiculous concept that the brain is going to allow large swathes to go unused. It's completely false. It's much closer to most of the brain most of the time. And when you try and find out where does that statement first originate, this idea that we're only using a limited portion of our brain, it's really, really difficult to find where it first emerges. But everything I've found so far is ridiculous. Ignore it. What I would like you to start to think about is, if we're using most of our brain most of the time, what am I using it for? What am I focusing on and not on? And we will tap back into some of that when we start to get to habits. That's really important when we start to think about the stuff that potentially helps or hinders us when it comes to resilience. So number 2, about 20% of all the oxygen and calories is burnt by the brain. It's really surprising. I've talked about this for years, but I still find it surprising that the brain is such a hog for calories. It really is. It really burns huge quantities of calories. And you probably know yourself, when you start to get a bit flat, sometimes just eating something or taking in some even some fluids can help bring us back on track. That does not mean to say that you can go back to your friends and family and say, some bloke in glasses, psychologist guy, said that because I'm a thinker, I can gorge on crap all day. I didn't say that. All of the other messages about calories and what we eat are true. But I just want to get people to start to realise how hungry for these raw resources our brain is. And if we don't have them, it can be very challenging to do what we need to do, even at a basic level, let alone meeting some of the challenges in life. So apart from Adam, I can't see anyone else's camera at the moment, but let me just assume that some of us might be getting close to 24 or just nudged past 24 maybe. That could be quite a challenging statement, number 3. But what I'm drawing on there is it's quite a large sample size in this study, about 3,500 people, and they essentially got people to play a computer game that symbolises a whole bunch of stuff that we do in life, making quick decisions, weighing up pros and cons, stuff like this. And they were suggesting that from about 24 years of age, they think it's slightly before 24, but from 24 the data was significant. The cognitive, like the raw cognitive resources to make these quick decisions starts to fade. But for those of us who have gone past 24 years and we're not bumping into door frames and losing the power of speech, what is it you think might be coming along and hiding this fact? Because that's the way the researchers suggest this plays out. What hides the effect of this decline in raw kind of mental horsepower? And feel free to put it in the chat. I hope I can see the chat. And I can always come to you, Adam, put you on the spot. What do you think comes along and masks the effect of this decline in raw horsepower as we start to age?
Hard to say, really, Gary. I mean, incidentally, for the audience, there is a question tab and a polling tab on your screen rather than a chat tab. So do feel free to put questions in there.
So I can't seem to see it.
I'm not sure I've got an answer to your question, Gary.
What does age provide you? Let me put it that way. What might age provide you, Adam?
What might age provide me? Sorry, you're going to have to rephrase that again. I'm sorry, yeah.
What do we gather as we get older?
Well, arguably wisdom, but I might defy all the odds, to be honest with you.
Yeah, wisdom, potentially the wisdom is coming through experience, but what we're also doing is we're setting up a whole bunch of habits, routines, patterns to shortcut our analysis, processing of the world around us. And those shortcuts allow us to operate and interact very confidently, very fluidly with the world around us without burning huge quantities of fuel trying to process this stuff. So I'm starting to get some of the chat pasted through to me now. Alcohol, drugs, poor health, cognitive disorders. I'm not sure where to go with that one. But yeah, experience. Sabine is saying experience as well. And that, I want to draw attention to that because experience, habits, routine, whether we like it or not, they are going to be there. They're going to be very helpful in some situations, and sometimes they're not. And particularly when we start to think about some of the the things that we say to ourselves, some of the thoughts that we produce, some of them are going to help and some of them are not. And it's worthwhile putting them under the microscope from time to time to ponder, is the way I'm thinking and seeing the world helping me or not? So the last but not least, brain cells shrink while we sleep. That sounds ridiculous. How could that possibly be true? Now, I should add, as we start to wake up, the brain cells return to their original size. But if I put that on there, you'd all just nod politely and say, well, that sounds sensible. So, yeah, forgive me for leaving off that very important part. But what I'll do now is I've got some slides to kind of explain this a little bit better, to bring it to life. And what we're looking at in a moment is a whole bunch of studies that have been replicated in mice populations. But the reason I'm talking about them is they've essentially identified a set of plumbing in the mouse brain that we share as humans, which is why they're very interested in what is happening in these mice populations. So first things first, what you're looking at there on the screen are a bunch of brain cells that are tightly packed within the skull. It's not a bunch of grapes. Now, what happens is that the brain is trying to use that fixed space within the skull as efficiently as possible. So they're really quite tightly crammed together, basically. And as our cells in our body or our brain do anything, they produce a byproduct of cellular activity. It's called detritus, crap, detritus. Take your pick of those labels, but it's essentially a byproduct of cellular activity you do not want and you want to remove. And they really struggled in the research world to try and work out, where does this stuff go in the brain? They identified what happens in the body, but there was a bit of a mystery in the brain. But this is the process they've started to identify now. So if we change the scale a little bit now, what you're seeing there is the brain cells are shrinking. And this process of shrinking occurs immediately the mice start to fall asleep. They identified that the shrinking can occur up to 50, sometimes 60% in size. This reduction was shown, which is an enormous reduction in size, basically. So this process, like I said, is happening immediately the mice start to fall asleep. At the same time, the brains start to release something called cerebral spinal fluid. And essentially what happens is it comes along and it washes away this byproduct of cellular activity. It removes it from the system. And that, for me, makes a really nice analogy for this idea of a brain shower or something along these lines. But if we are not getting a good night's sleep, this process doesn't happen. So you start to get a build-up. There's a couple of proteins that will build up, kind of like plaque on the teeth or lime scale on a kettle maybe, and it has essentially a detrimental effect on our brain. But regardless of that, just missing a night's sleep or having a poor quality night's sleep, you don't need me to tell you the effects, but I suspect you've experienced that your ability to focus your attention will fall off a cliff. Your ability to remember new stuff, same pattern, same for recording information that you already knew. It shows a similar pattern. But you will also find your ability to manage and control your emotions will show a very similar pattern. You will find it much harder to do some of the managing of the emotions, should we say, turning things around. Some of the things that we heard in the speakers earlier that take quite a bit of quite grown-up thinking, resources maybe to enact. So basically, the shortcut to this bit is sleep. It's really, really important. Everything that you do could be made a bit easier or a bit harder, or maybe a lot, depending on the amount and the quality of sleep that we get. Okay. And I've tried to put together some other bits that I think are really essential, just like core things that we need to be providing our brains to do the basics, let alone some of the other stuff that's going to come along when our resilience is being challenged. So I won't say anything more about sleep because I could talk all day about sleep. A fantastic book if you're into this kind of stuff. There's a guy called Matthew Walker, and there's a book called Why We Sleep. It's essentially the neuroscience of sleep, and it will tell you a lot more about sleep if you're interested in this stuff. The second image there is about getting out into nature, and humans have something they term a biophilic reaction. So all that means is that we have this natural draw to nature, and there's a whole array of studies that I shan't go into right now, but the point I'm making here is when we are in nature, or when we see a scene of nature, and humans are so daft, just a picture of a natural scene can evoke some of this stuff. It seems to help mop up the byproduct of kind of negative emotions, and helps to promote positive emotions. And in certainly the last 16 months or so, there's so many of the people I've been working with have exercised that ability to get out and just change things up. And I think what it also provides is a rest, a change, a different perspective maybe from the stuff that we're doing. And that can be really valuable for seeing things in a different light, overcoming the challenges maybe. There's no getting away from it. Exercise is really good for you. You've heard that message before. It's really good for the brain. And if you don't like the idea of running on a treadmill and sweating with a bunch of people you don't know, just think of the word movement. Forget exercise, but just the act of movement can be really useful for the brain in a whole array of ways. I mentioned the calories, and hydration I should be also talking about there. But putting the right fuel into the system is essential to have the basic raw elements that we need to do anything in our lives. And we heard earlier from James and Hannah talking about social connections. Humans are wired to be social. That doesn't mean you have to have hundreds of friends. It is better to have less but deeper quality relationships where you can really open up and feel safe in. But social contact is a must for humans, particularly in moments of challenge and adversity and all those kind of things. And last but not least, challenge. Challenge is really good for the brain. It stops it kind of just finding comfortable grooves and just looking after them essentially in the brain. The big difference will be our perspective of the challenge. Can I do it? Is it too much? Is it my challenge or your challenge? Challenge itself is really good for the brain. The perspective that we take could be a big impact on how we experience it. So that's a whistle-stop tour of some stuff that is really important as the bedrock for anything else. So that kind of the brain basics. And it'd be worth pondering, what is it that you are doing or not doing to take care of your brain? Okay. So let's move into the world of habits briefly. And I really like this quote about, we make our habits and habits then make us. And the reason I like it, because there's a big warning in there, be careful what you do regularly. But I really like the idea of control, that we can do something about it. We can take the initiative and change patterns, routines and habits, okay? So I'm just going to do this very briefly rather than have polls and chats and all this kind of stuff here. Hopefully the picture is familiar with you, and some of you may be shouting out, yeah, I know, it's the Mona Lisa, it's that Da Vinci guy, isn't it? Something along those lines. And maybe some of you have seen painting in real life. But I suspect none of you, unless you've seen me do this before, have seen that exact painting before. Because I expect what you're more familiar with is the painting on the right. But I've shown so many groups, and big groups, small groups, nobody ever says she's pointing the wrong way or facing the wrong way. And I use it as a whole array of other things, but as a simple kind of, in this case, a perceptual illusion that we miss stuff, and we miss it because of experience. And those experiences essentially are set up to help shortcut making sense of the world around us. And in this case, the colours are about right, the shapes are about right. That's Mona Lisa, Da Vinci. Why is he showing us this? You're not essentially looking for what's wrong. Your expectations, I guess, are shaping your reality. And that is really important when we start to think about the habits that are helping or hindering, and where have they come from? Are they fit for purpose? Do they need changing? Because whether you like it or not, we are far more limited in our processing capacity than we would like to admit. So I'm using money as an analogy here. The front part of the brain is called the prefrontal cortex. It's the bit that does conscious, rational decision making and thought. If we're thinking about how much information this part of our brain can process, and we're using money, we think of like change in your pocket, a handful of change, something along these lines. So when you start to look at the unconscious processing capacity, you could be thinking of it as the US economy in terms of the amount of information it can process. And when you see it like that, it makes absolute sense for the brain to spot patterns, punt it over to autopilot. Let autopilot, with this enormous resource, it's a much more efficient use of calories as well than the prefrontal cortex. It makes sense that we will start to look for these habits very quickly and allow autopilot to run the show. Okay, so this has nothing to do with us being lazy or stupid or anything like this. We are limited as humans and we set these habits up. So it's worth kind of, rather than ignoring them, accepting that they're there and working out which ones are in need of attention, I guess. And so what I often do is with groups or with individuals, I get them to think about these elements of what makes us, of behaviour, of perceptions, and our thoughts and thinking. And I try to get across to people that this is kind of like the centre core of what makes us, why we do what we do. And another day I could put emotions in there, but for today we're looking at these red arrows, and I'm trying to build this idea that these arrows are habits. They get set up really quickly. Once they are set up, they are enduring, they are very, very difficult to break, and essentially they look after themselves. So your expectations shape your reality. You keep behaving in the same way, you keep exposing yourself to the same stuff, internally or externally. And I just get people to start to think about what is potentially nourishing or poisoning one's, in this case, resilience tree. So it might be the stuff that you say to yourself, the stuff that you see, the people you talk to or not, or maybe it's at an organizational level. It's the cultures, the relationships that you have at work, the work that you do, the amount of it, who with, and all those kinds of things. They can have a really big impact on these patterns. Okay, I suppose the pondering there is, do you know what is nourishing or poisoning your resilience tree? So that's when you are getting around to the meandering, that might be a worthwhile ponderance and thing to unpack. Okay, so finally, let's look at this last bit of focused action. All right, great. So is there anything I should be doing? And I'm going to give you a couple of things in a moment to stick into your plan. You know, what specific things should I be going at and doing? And the first thing I will put up is a quote from Napoleon. And until I think COVID turned up, I would have used it quite regularly with leadership teams, and getting them to think about some basic stuff that they could be doing to help lead better. Okay, but what I found is in the last 16 months, I really like using as a personal leadership kind of mantra. I'll give you the quote so you can see what I'm talking about. So Napoleon said, a leader's role is to define reality and then give hope. Now, this is not just some vapid quote that I found off LinkedIn or something like that. The reason I'm picking on it is it speaks to some really central things that the brain needs to feel comfortable, happy, in equilibrium, basically. It's obsessed with the future so that it can keep you safe when the future arrives. And when things are all up in the air, it can be very difficult to find what is happening, what is the clarifying reality or something along those lines. And we can get lost looking at all of the stuff that we don't know, and then avoid looking at the stuff that we do know. It might be as simple as just narrowing your focus, bringing the time scale closer, something along those lines. The other element is about giving hope. And you just have to turn that on its head. And the idea of absence of hope, you're in the world of clinical depression. Nothing you want in your lives or the lives of your colleagues and families. So I think, regardless if you're a leader or an individual, we owe it to ourselves for brain health, particularly in times of challenge, is to get some clarity over what is happening, why, how, when. And then what do I do about it? What could I do? What first steps? What have I done in the past? All of those things are really, really important to help us feel comfortable and confident in our situations. Okay, so there's a quote from Napoleon. I like it because it's really succinct, but I think it has quite a profound ripple effect. The other bit, and it's chiming in with some of the speakers this morning. So Hannah and Greg, you were talking also about taking action. And I think there's a need to resist this idea of learned helplessness that can occur a degree a day over a long period of time, we get ourselves into a position where we no longer try to help ourselves, and we start to catastrophize. Everything's bad. It's always been bad. It will always be bad. Something along those lines. We really owe it to ourselves to practice throwing stones at that thinking. And I would be so bold to say that we always have choice. You can choose to change things in the physical world, and you can also change things in the mental world. These things don't come easy, I get it. But if you're not practicing, why should you be good at doing these things? As the point I made earlier. And this is the last kind of thing that we could be doing now. So I'm just about to wrap up. And I will leave this research on the screen for a moment, just so you can start to think about, how do I do against these things? This is looking at within the work setting, in order of importance, characteristics of resilient people, basically. Optimism is number one, seeing that silver lining, being free from stress and anxiety, and dealing with it in some way, shape or form. And then being accountable for your situation, being open and flexible. And then last but not least, do you focus on the problem, or do you use it as a call to action for doing something about it? All of those things can be improved through practice, okay? So there's some food for thought, but if you start to put it back into that framework right from the beginning, there needs to be a period of reflection, a development of some kind of plan, and then there's no getting away from it. You've got to practice, you've got to put in some effort and keep putting in that focused attention. And if you do that, there's a good chance that you will be shifting some of those habits that will hopefully help in terms of resilience. So I'm sure we've probably run out of time, Adam, but I'm very happy to field questions now, but also I'm sure you'll find me very easily online if you wanted to pick up any of these questions, anything that went too fast. Obviously, I get it. 30 minutes is very quick. I'm very I love to talk about this stuff. Hopefully that comes across. Find me, and I will continue to love to talk about it. Basically,
Gary, thank you so much. What a jam-packed session that was for half an hour, and I know we could spend days and days talking about this stuff. And I think, in the interest of time, and the need to, as you were saying, refuel the system. I think coffee is calling shortly for everyone as the first coffee break. So we'll probably hold off questions.
Sure.
But if there are any from the audience after today, do email them to me and I'll get them to Gary. I think one quick observation from me, Gary, really from what you've been saying there, particularly about learned helplessness, and alluding to the conversation we had with James, Anna and Gregory. One of the characteristics of good resilience, if you like, if there is such a thing as being human and forgiving of oneself as well, because, I learned very, very early on in my career to worry about what I can control and worry less about what I can't, and try and grow my sphere of control, if you like. But and would you agree that, I think we have to be human?
I totally agree. And I think, if nothing else, the last 6 months, 16 months, whatever it is has forced people to accept that life is messy, and it always was. Humans are messy. Stuff happens outside of this camera, and in the last 16 months, I think people have been far more welcoming. That cats have turned up, children have turned in, and all this kind of stuff. And we've just maybe been a bit more forgiving of ourselves and other people, and life goes on. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person. So I really like that idea of kind of control the stuff that you can control. But it takes practice. It's easy to say these things, but in the moment it can be really difficult to give up this idea of I'm focusing on all the stuff I can't do. But it can be improved. I use this idea of mental gymnastics or something like this. We can practice reinterpreting things, focusing on different things, and lo and behold, that will help us to do things in a more sustainable way, more happy way, maybe.
Right. Thank you, Gary. And I think my main takeaway from this is those days where I think I don't use most of my brain most of the time, I need to be more forgiving because they haven't quite a lot, it appears. Anyway, I need to say thank you. We need to allow people to go for a cup of coffee. So once again, my sincere thanks for your time today.
A pleasure. Nice to see you again. Thanks, Adam.